Today we are talking to Professor Alvin Roth at Stanford University and the author of Who Gets What and Why, The New Economics of Matchmaking and Market Design. Welcome to Redera.
Thank you.
We also have Thomas Buckingham with us as well.
Yes, good morning.
Hi.
What is the book all about and what do economists do?
Well, the book is all about markets and the big variety of markets that there are in the world and how markets are human artifacts that people make. And it's about how economists have started to get involved in that ancient process of market design and how to make markets work better when they're not doing what we want them to.
You know, people sometimes fail to understand that there are markets all around us. Sometimes they may not appear as markets, which we are generally conditioned to understand the markets only exist when there's money involved in it. But you very well said in the book, there are markets all over us. And could you expand on that a little bit, please?
Sure. So as you say, I think often when people think about markets, they think about commodity markets. So when you're trying to buy 5,000 bushels of hard red number 2 winter wheat, you don't care who you're buying from. That's such a precise description of what you're buying that you can buy it from anyone and they don't care who they're selling to. But when you offer someone a job or when you're trying to get a job, that's a very personal offer. You don't just offer a job to anyone. You offer it to a particular applicant. You don't just apply for a job at any firm. You apply for a very particular job. So those are matching markets in which you can't just choose what you want. You also have to be chosen. And they're every bit as much as markets as a commodity market, but price isn't the only thing that decides who gets what. And as you mentioned, and as I talk about at length in the book, there are markets in which we don't allow prices to play any role. But even in labor markets, which I think are a great example of matching markets, when you get a job, the first question your friends ask you is not what's your salary, but it's where are you working? And you might turn down a job with a higher salary to get a job that you prefer. So it's not only prices that are going on in many of the markets that we deal with throughout our lives, some of the most important markets.
Before I go a little bit more in the details, would you explain that, as you explained with so many different examples in the book, especially with the doctors' residency programs and others, that there's a limited supply and generally the demand is larger than the supply. And that's where the market design becomes very important. Would you expand on that, please?
Well, one function of markets is to allocate scarce goods. But even when goods are not scarce, the question of who should have which jobs, how to match people and jobs together productively so that people have jobs that they'll be good at and enjoy and jobs will employ people who are good at them and do a good job is a complicated process. And so as you mentioned, one of the markets I've helped design is the medical match, the marketplace through which American doctors get their first jobs as residents, the National Resident Matching Program. And there are lots of jobs for new doctors. And so they have to go on lots of interviews and then they have to figure out which of the jobs they would like them. And that was a process that years ago didn't work very well. And one manner in which it didn't work very well is doctors started getting hired earlier and earlier, so that around the 1940s, doctors were getting hired 2 years before they graduated from medical school. And that lots of information is lost when you try to make contracts so very early. And one of the things that the medical marketplace did is develop a centralized clearinghouse. And as the medical marketplace has changed, that's needed some revision over time, and I've helped with that.
You explained very well that, we generally use the markets with the terms like thin markets, and then you talk quite a bit about thick markets and congestions and other things. What can person or a market designer can do to make the markets thick?
Right. So markets happen in marketplaces. Often economists got used to thinking of markets as if they existed in thin air. There's the and that's the market. But while economists might like to concentrate on markets, entrepreneurs concentrate on marketplaces. So think about a market like Airbnb. Okay, they're a new marketplace made by the Airbnb Corporation, right? There are particular guys involved. If you can read their corporate history, it started very small. And their first challenge was to make the market thick, to not just be renting out their apartments and their friends' apartments, but to have lots of apartments that travelers could rent. And on the other hand, to have lots of travelers who wanted to rent apartments. So they built a website starting in San Francisco. And as they got bigger and bigger, they had competing websites. There was one I know about called Crash Patter in London. And as they got bigger, they bought those. So that was part of their process of making the market thick, having not just apartments in San Francisco, but apartments in London, apartments in Berlin, that you could rent, and, around the United States, certainly, and having travelers who might want to come and rent your apartment coming from San Francisco or London or Berlin. And that helped them get a thick market. And then, of course, as I discuss in the book, once a marketplace has helped make the market thick, the next thing it has to do is help all those many people who come together to the marketplace to try to transact with each other. It has to help them deal with the congestion of having so many apartments and so many travelers, if you're Airbnb, at the same time, how to figure out which apartments you'd like and how should someone who's offering an apartment figure out, in case he gets multiple applications, who to offer it to, things like that. So one of the ways to think about the problem they had to overcome is now their competitors aren't other websites. Their competitors are big hotel corporations like Hyatt and Hilton. And think how hard it would be to get a hotel room if when you called up the San Francisco Hilton, you could only inquire about one room at a time. Can I reserve room 583 next Friday night? And they'd say, oh, I'm so sorry, room 583 is already booked. And then they'd hang up and you'd have to call again to ask about room 584. The reason I speak about it that way is that's a little bit Airbnb's problem. Many of their rooms and apartments and houses are operated by a single proprietor who has only that one property. So if I'm trying to rent out my guest bedroom on Airbnb and you inquire about it and I've already filled it, then you're disappointed and you have to go back and try again, as you would if Hilton Hotels would only talk to you about one room. And you could easily imagine that if that were a cumbersome process, you'd give up on Airbnb and just call up Hilton Hotels, which in fact will tell you if they have any room available. So one of the things Airbnb had to do was make sure that this congestion wasn't too burdensome, make the process quick, make it easy to find out whether you can get a room or not. And they're taking lots of steps in that direction. And a lot of their success has to do with the fact that they're pretty successful at that.
And just as Amazon has done in building a marketplace where you can go to one site and buy products from different suppliers, but pay only one price to one Amazon, and then they take care of the congestion issue.
Right. So another way to think about Amazon is they've got great search engines. Amazon, as you say, now does many things. You can buy many things from many sellers. But let's just concentrate on books for a moment. They have a lot of books. If you had to look through those books in alphabetical order by author, they'd be a terrible site. You'd never find the books you want. But instead, what you do when you're looking, you type in something you know about the book, and it pretty quickly brings it to you. And then it also suggests to you other books that people buy who bought this book. It does a lot of things to make it easier for you to walk yourself through their vast bookstore and find the books that you might want.
And as you explained, that for the thick markets to behave or function properly, the markets have to be safe or marketplace have to be safe and simple.
Right. So you already mentioned one aspect of Amazon's simplicity. I can put together a shopping basket of many different things, books and blue jeans and headphones for my telephone, and just pay once with a credit card that Amazon already has on file. And they know my home address, so I can very quickly put together a shopping basket from different vendors and pay just once. So when you think about it, that's a little bit what a supermarket does, right? You could try to go to a butcher and a baker and a candlestick maker to buy your meat and your bread and your candlesticks. But if you go to a supermarket, well, they may not have candlesticks, but you buy meat and you buy fish and you buy fruit, and those come from different vendors. The people who grow the oranges are not the same people as the people who catch the fish or the people who grow the cows. But the supermarket is a little bit, Amazon is a little like a supermarket. Supermarket is a little like Amazon. They bring many things together in one place. You fill up your cart, you pay in one transaction, and you go home. So they're dealing with congestion. They're helping you. A supermarket is convenient because if you need to buy a lot of things to make dinner, then it could take you a long time to assemble them. But a supermarket makes it easy to assemble. It creates a thick market. There's lots of different things to buy, and you can do it pretty simply.
I'm just switching the topic here a little bit. If you would explain the kidney exchange, which is one of the markets where the price is not a factor that determines the behavior or performance or the functioning of the market, what is that a designer really should consider, or how do you prioritize? As you also explained, the airspace. When you land a plane, there's a limited space and everybody wants to use it. These are just one or two examples I'm throwing, but if you want to kind of explain, how do you solve a situation, or how do you propose to solve a situation for something like kidney exchange?
Okay, well, so let me take a step back and explain a little bit what kidney exchange is. You have two kidneys, and I hope you're really healthy and that they're both very healthy because you need your kidneys to live. And if someone you loved had kidney failure, that's a deadly disease. They can stay alive for a while on dialysis, but the treatment of choice, what they ultimately want if they have end-stage renal disease, is a kidney transplant. And right now, this morning in the United States, there are 100,000 people waiting for a deceased donor kidney, a kidney that could be made available if someone dies in a certain way, a brain death that leaves the organs viable. But we only get about 11,000 of those kidneys a year that we can transplant. So there's 100,000 people waiting for something that arrives at the rate of 11,000 a year. The waiting list is long, many years, and it's dangerous. You can die while waiting, and thousands of people die every year. So there aren't enough deceased donor kidneys, and of course, it would be good to get more, but that's hard to do. Only about half of Americans are registered on the deceased donor waiting list, and only about 1% of deaths allow organs to be used for transplantation. But there's another source of transplants, which, as I said, you have two kidneys, and if you're healthy enough, you could remain healthy with just one kidney. So if someone you loved was on this long, slow, dangerous waiting list, you could save their life by giving them one of your kidneys. And sometimes it happens that even though you're healthy enough to give someone a kidney, you can't give it to the person you love because kidneys have to be carefully matched. And so what kidney exchange is about is supposing you are healthy enough to give someone a kidney, but you can't give to the person you love. And I'm healthy enough to give a kidney, but I can't give to the person I love. It might be in a big database of incompatible patient-donor pairs like us that we'd find that I can give to your patient. My kidney would work in your patient, and your kidney would work in my patient. And so these two pairs of patients and donors could exchange kidneys, saving two lives, getting two transplants going. So that's the simplest kind of kidney exchange, and there are now many more elaborate kinds. And as you mentioned, no money changes hands because in the United States and in most of the world, it's against the law to pay money for a human organ for transplantation. But we can nevertheless make a marketplace, a big centralized clearinghouse that first we need a big database that makes the market thick. Then we have to find ways to organize the surgeries, some of which are involve more than just two pairs, so that we can accomplish them in a safe and expeditious way. So that involves dealing with congestion. So in that respect, we're a little bit like Airbnb and Amazon, even though no money changes hands because it's a felony in the United States to pay money for a kidney for transplant.
Now, could we actually modify that system by perhaps having Medicare offer early enrollment to people that might be willing to give up a kidney, even though they don't have a loved one in particular in mind?
Yeah.
But they could, if you get a healthy 45-year-old person who's willing to give up a kidney in order to go on Medicare early and be covered for, that 20, 25 years, wouldn't that make sense? And why don't economists lobby Congress in order to do that?
Well, that would make a lot of sense because every time you get an additional transplant of American, it saves Medicare about $250,000 because Medicare, regardless of your age, covers you if you have end-stage renal disease, and dialysis is much more expensive than transplantation. So not only would this make sense, it would be self-financing. However, the current American law, which is called the National Organ Transplant Act, what it makes a felony is not simply giving money for a kidney. It says no one may give valuable consideration for a human organ for transplant. And valuable consideration is a capacious legal phrase, which probably means that you can't give them medical insurance and Medicare. But it would be good to change. And right now, a congressman from Pennsylvania is introducing a bill. His name is Cartwright, introducing a bill that would remove some of the financial disincentives, at least, to donating kidneys. And there's an active discussion, and has been for many years, on whether it really is a good idea to have this strict barrier between compensation and donation. And one of the chapters I have in my book is on what I call repugnant transactions, because this is something that's, compensation for kidneys is not just against the law in the United States. It's against the law just about everywhere in the world. So the simple arguments that we economists like to make, it's not going to be sufficient to just repeat them slower and louder. There's something else going on. And there are, of course, lots of repugnant transactions. A repugnant transaction is a transaction that some people would like to engage in and other people think they shouldn't. And, since we're all sitting here in the United States, think about our recent history over the last decade and a half on same-sex marriage. A marriage is a transaction that two people want to engage in with each other. And Americans have been bitterly divided about whether people who want to marry each other ought to be able to if they're of the same sex. And the first state to make it legal was Massachusetts in 2004, I think. And in 2015, the Supreme Court completed what was a long, bitterly fought process and made it legal in every state. So there's something that was, but of course, Americans are still divided about it. We're having, I understand we're having some political campaigns right now, and I bet that you could find divided opinions among the candidates. So kidneys are a little like that. It's against the law everywhere in the world to buy and sell kidneys. In Israel, if you are a donor, you will get priority for receiving a deceased donor organ should you ever need one. So you don't get Medicare. It's not nearly that good a thing, but they're giving you something very close to what you're giving. If you donate an organ and then you later need one, you'll bubble up to the top of the list. So that's a good thing, and that's helped in Israel. I've just published some papers about their experience. But it's this question of repugnant transactions. For hundreds of years in the Middle Ages, charging interest on loans was very firmly frowned upon in Europe. That repugnance has largely gone away. We could hardly have the kind of market for global capitalist market that we have if we didn't have a market for capital. But other kinds of repugnance go the other way. The most common way to buy passage across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States in the time of the early days of the Republic was to sign a contract of indentured servitude. You'd arrive in Boston Harbor and the ship captain would sell your unconditional labor services for 5 years. Basically, you'd sell yourself into voluntary slavery in order to come to North America. Well, that's not a legal labor contract anymore. We now find that repugnant. And, there are many things still in flux that way. I was recently in Germany. My book was translated into German, and I went and gave some talks. And when I talked about repugnance, I said to them, look, here we are in Germany, but I live in California. In California, prostitution is illegal and surrogacy is legal. You can pay someone to bear a child for you. But in Germany, prostitution is legal and surrogacy is illegal. So, prostitution and surrogacy, I don't want to draw parallels between them, except that one is illegal in one place and legal in the other. And I think my German audience thought that they had it about right. Prostitution should be legal and surrogacy should be illegal. Whereas here in California, many people feel the reverse. So I think economists understand less than we should about non-economist ideas about economic transactions. But these can be very important in the design of marketplaces and how markets work. And indeed, when I first wrote about this, I wrote a paper called Repugnance as a Constraint on Markets. We don't just allow ourselves to engage in every market. Some markets we restrict. And of course, it's easy to think of them, right? The market for narcotic drugs, right? Opium is illegal in most places. Whereas marijuana, which is illegal in most American venues, is now legal in several states, in Colorado and Washington and Oregon. Here in California, medical marijuana is legal, and I understand you can get a prescription in 20 minutes on a website. So I think that's going to be like same-sex marriage. I'm guessing that 20 years from now, marijuana will not be an illegal transaction in most of the United States.
Yeah, another thing that came up to me when I read your book was your discussion of the allocation of schools in New York. And
yeah.
The question is, why does New York not have a voucher system to allow maybe juniors and seniors to receive a voucher and go to a private high school, a senior high school that would be closer to a trade or associated with something the student was interested in pursuing, more than just forcing them into the existing school system?
Well, that's a good question, and it has to do a lot with our general system of public education that's both free and compulsory. So I think that I don't write about vouchers in the book, but I think that a lot of the concern that people have about vouchers is that they might create a school system that doesn't fully replace what the public school system is supposed to do. Maybe a little bit of an analogy is something like FedEx and the post office. Most of us are pretty unhappy with the post office, but it does. But we live in urban areas. One of the things about the post office is it delivers letters everywhere, and the idea was it was supposed to knit together the country, and indeed it did very effectively in its early days. Rural free delivery made a giant difference in the economic health of rural Americans, and it came with marketplace innovations that are a lot like Amazon. It came with Sears Roebuck mail order catalogs and Montgomery Ward mail order catalogs, and all of a sudden with rural free delivery, you could be sitting on your farm in some out of the way place and get stuff delivered to you. So that was just as big a marketplace revolution as Amazon was. And so the thing about schools, I guess, is they are available to everyone. And people who worry about vouchers versus public schools worry that we might hollow out the public school system. But what I wrote about in my book was, even if you've got a municipal school system, you still have to figure out which children should go to which schools. And parents may have valuable information about which schools would be good for their children, and you'd like to incorporate that. One of the big things that marketplaces are supposed to do is aggregate information that's held in a decentralized way by the parents of the kindergartners, for instance. And there may be scarce resources to allocate. There may be some kindergartens that are better than others. And one reason why American school districts are turning to school choice is the concern that the children who grow up in poor neighborhoods could be condemned to go to poor schools, and that would exacerbate the problems of intergenerational poverty and things like that. And so what school choice does is it allows people to move away from those poor schools. And while the systems that my colleagues and I have developed in the United States, in a bunch of American cities, don't involve vouchers, they often involve charter schools, which are privately run schools that are financed the same way municipal schools are, through taxpayer contributions. And in cities like Denver and New Orleans, we have been able to organize the school choice so that you can seamlessly apply both to the municipal schools and the charter schools. So that's a step in the direction that I think you're interested in. The difference between, say, charter schools and vouchers is funding, how the funding flows.
I'm just keeping the discussion moving along. You had explained in the book very well in order for the marketplaces to be attractive and function properly, you also need a large number of players on both sides, or a significant number of players, and the rulemaking has to be there, because if the rulemaking is there, then everybody knows what are the ground rules. But those rulemakings, as you were explaining, keeps evolving with our values as we change and grow in our acceptance or not acceptance. How do you see, we have talked about a lot of different problems, including if I want to go to Harvard or Yale or Stanford, doesn't mean that I can go to Harvard or Stanford. Stanford also has to be ready to accept me.
Right.
Which you explained very well. How do you explain the concept of deferred algorithm, and that is really where the solution comes in?
Well, so deferred acceptance algorithm is an important tool that we've used in medical marketplaces and in school choice, not in college admissions but the idea of a deferred acceptance algorithm is to create a marketplace in which it's safe for people to reveal their preferences. So let me talk about it in the case of school choice. New York City used to have a semi-centralized school choice process. I'm speaking now with their high school choices, in which families put down a rank order list of, this is my first choice high school, my second choice, my third choice. These were copied and sent to the high schools as the student's application. This student applied to you. Here's his application. And then the high schools would make independent admissions decisions, and the Department of Education would assemble these and send a letter to students saying, you've been admitted to these 3 high schools, please choose one. And if you'd like to be on the waiting list to another one, let us know. And they'd process those, and then the offers that had been turned down could be offered to new students and so forth. And that was a slow and cumbersome process that made it very hard for them to get all the kids in school by September. And so each year, New York is big. Each year they had put about 30,000 ninth graders into schools that they hadn't expressed any preference for, just because they ran out of time to send all these letters back and forth. And additionally, an additional problem in that old system was that the principals, in getting your application, they saw your rank order list. So as if I were the principal of Aviation High School in New York City between LaGuardia and Kennedy Airport, I might adopt a rule that said, I'm only going to admit children who apply to me as their first choice. And when I see you've applied to me and I'm your second choice, I won't even consider you. And of course, that meant that it wasn't safe for you to tell the city what your first choice was, because you might not really have a lot of choices that you could make that way. And so you, instead of thinking what's your true first choice, which might stop you from ever going to aviation high school if it wasn't your first choice, you had to think to yourself, what's the best school? What's the school I like best that if I say it's my first choice, I'll have a good chance of getting into, which is very different from figuring out what high school you'd like to go to. So we helped New York City change its algorithm, and they now use, as you say, a deferred acceptance algorithm. And that works as follows. The students submit rank order lists, but they're private. They don't go to the school. They just go to the city. And the schools, if they have preferences, they submit their preferences. Otherwise, they may have priorities for different categories of students. And now, what the computerized clearinghouse does after all the students have submitted their carefully considered preferences, and the schools have done the same, is it has all the students apply to their first choice school, and the school and schools that get more applicants than they have positions have to reject the excess applicants. And the way they decide which ones to reject is they order them in terms of their preferences. We keep our top choice, top priority students in, but when we run out of spaces, we reject the rest. But they don't accept the ones they haven't rejected yet. They are going to defer acceptance until the very end after they see who else has applied. And the second step of the algorithm is every student who's been rejected applies to his next choice. And every school now looks at all the applications it's gotten, the ones it was holding from before and the ones it just got now, and it orders them in terms of its original preference ordering that it submitted, or priority ordering. And that means it doesn't care when you apply to it. The school doesn't care or know whether you applied to them as your first or second choice. If they like you a lot, you go right to the top of their list whenever you apply. And if they have excess applicants, they reject the ones who are beyond their capacity. And this keeps going. The students apply, they get ordered in terms of the school's preferences, some rejections are issued, and the algorithm only stops when no more rejections are issued. And at that point, every school now accepts the students whose applications it's holding. So that has a couple of interesting properties. One of them is that you only get rejected by a school if it fills all its places with students that it preferred to you, with students who had higher priority than you. So the only reason you don't get into a school is it's already full with students who had better access to that school. And the second thing to notice is that if you don't get into your first choice school, your chance of getting into your second choice is just as high as if you had said that school was your first choice, because when they put you on their list, when they rank you on their list, they don't care when you applied. So if you had really high priority at your second choice school, you go right to the top of their list and you'll get in. And that's true for your third choice and your fourth choice, for all your choices. It means if you don't get your top three choices, your chance of getting your fourth choice is just as good as if you had said that was your first choice. So you never feel forced to claim that your fourth choice school is really your first choice. There's no advantage to doing that, unlike in the old system where if you didn't apply to some schools as your first choice, you couldn't get in at all. So those are I think, pretty big improvements. And that's how the deferred acceptance algorithm works for high schools in New York, for schools at all levels in Boston and New Orleans and Denver and some other cities.
So does this approach a Pareto optimal solution to the problem?
That's a good question. That's an economist question. So let me unpack that a little bit. Something is Pareto optimal if you can't make all participants better off. So to talk about Pareto optimality, you have to talk about who the participants are. And in particular, you have to say, are the schools participants or are just the students participants? Okay. So when the schools are participants, as they surely are in New York City, where the schools can also make strategic decisions, this is Pareto optimal. If you think, however, that the schools are just objects to be allocated, then you would want to ask that question, is it Pareto optimal for the students? And the answer is it may not be. That has to do with the fact that schools have broad indifferences. That is, in a city where the schools don't have an active role, the schools don't have preferences, but rather the mechanism, the school choice mechanism, gives children priorities at schools. So you might get priority to a certain school if you live close to it. You might get priority to a certain school if you have a reading score higher than a certain level, things like that. So the city makes decisions about which children have priority. But there'll be lots and lots of ties. Typically, those priorities are pretty broad. So two children who live in houses adjacent to each other, neither of whom has an older sibling who goes to the school and who have the same reading scores, are likely to have the same priority. And you can run into problems with Pareto optimality for students if you aren't careful how you break those ties. And if you're too careful about how you break the ties, if you insist on Pareto optimality for students, then you lose the property of strategy proofness that I recently told you about, which says that it's perfectly safe to tell the city your choices without having to be strategic about what you say is your first choice and what you say is your second choice. So your question has a complicated answer, one that we've thought a great deal about, and it involves reaching a certain sort of balance between Pareto optimality for the students and making it safe for them to convey their true preferences.
Right. So you don't end up with a strategic situation where you might reach a Nash equilibrium based upon the strategy of the parents trying to get into making sure they get into at least their second preferred choice.
Well, so what we're trying to do is make it a dominant strategy for every family to state their true preferences, to make it completely safe for them to state their preferences. Because loosely speaking, if you don't know what the preferences are, you can't give people what they want. So we feel that a first step is to make sure that it's safe for families to tell the school system what they want.
We've talked enough about economics and the book and the topic. Let's talk a little bit about the Nobel Laureate Al Roth. How did you arrive there from your humble original beginnings, and how did you get interested in all these esoteric concepts?
Well, I didn't study economics. I studied operations research. So all my higher education was in engineering. I was an undergraduate in the engineering school at Columbia University, and I actually did my graduate work at Stanford in the engineering school, and I got my PhD in 1974. And my first job was in an operations research group at the University of Illinois, but I asked for a joint appointment in economics because I was interested in game theory, and the good problems for game theory come from economics. So I dipped my toe in that way, and I started to become an economist. And then game theory flourished in economics. So when my engineering colleagues asked how I switched, I stick to the story that I didn't switch, that the disciplinary boundaries shifted around me, and that I'm still doing the kind of things I set out to do. But now I'm an economist. I'm a market designer. So that's how I got into economics. And market design is a new thing for economics. It's the engineering part of game theory, and my colleagues and I have helped do that. And so I actually shared the Nobel Prize with the late Lloyd Shapley, who was about 30 years older than I and was a towering figure in game theory when I was studying game theory. And we got it for the theory and practice of market design. So for thinking about things like the deferred acceptance algorithm, which is due to Shapley, and its various properties, some of which I studied, and then for making them happen in marketplaces, adapting them so that they could be adopted and implemented and used in real markets.
Are you working on any other projects that you would like to share with the audience of Redera, or?
I am. So I continue to work a lot on kidney exchange. That's complicated, constantly changing, and we do a lot of good there. So I'm actually going on a trip this week that will involve some of those things. But in general, I'm interested in matching markets, in markets where you can't just choose what you want, but also have to be chosen. And so one of the things I'm thinking about these days is refugee resettlement. There's lots of human migration going on right now. Some of it has to do with the multi-sided civil war in Syria and in Afghanistan, and some of it has to do with droughts in Africa and things like that. And we're not doing a very good job of resettling people, and we categorize them as either refugees or not refugees and feel different legal obligations to them, and it's not a safe market for them to give a lot of information. So in Europe, refugees try to arrive at the doorstep of where they want to go, Germany or Sweden, without having communicated beforehand, so it's a chaotic process. And it would be nice if we could think about how better to organize that. And it's going to be a difficult process. It's very political, of course. As I mentioned, you may know there's a presidential election in the United States right now, and one of the candidates doesn't like immigrants at all. And the same is true in Europe. So I don't anticipate that we're going to find orderly mechanisms for moving people in large numbers around very soon. But it's a problem that's going to be with us if the sea level rises in the next 50 to 100 years. There's going to be a lot of mass migration of human beings around the globe, and we had better think about how that should work, because it's a matching market. You can't just choose where you want to go. Not everyone is going to be given asylum in Germany or the United States. So one question is, well, what's your second choice? What's your third choice? Where might you have a prospect of being well integrated economically? And in the United States, our refugee resettlement authorities, and those of many countries, have in the past at least had the view that refugees should be spread thinly across the countryside where they'll assimilate invisibly. But that's not, in fact, the pattern that we observe, because once you're in the United States, you can go anywhere you want. So one of the examples I like to use is there's a concentration of Somali Americans in Lewiston, Maine. And the reason that's a good example is Maine is not like Somalia. The Somalis don't go to Maine because of the snowy winters. They go there because there's already a Somali community in Maine, and a way to go to a place where you could get a job and get integrated into the community is to go to a place where people speak your language, and even while you're learning English, you might be able to get a job if you're in such a place. So I think when we think about refugee resettlement, we're going to have to think about communities and not just individuals. Again, when you look at migration of non-refugees, just ordinary migration to the United States, you find lots of concentration of communities. Here in California, if you speak Spanish or Mandarin and have some skills, if you're a carpenter, say, you could get a job while learning English. Whereas if we tried to resettle you in Wyoming, you'd have to learn English before you could get a job. And so thinking about things like that, where should refugees go? Where should migrants go? How to facilitate the process of integrating them productively into new economies, I think is going to be a big deal, and I'm trying to learn more about it.
When you talked about matching markets, the matching of talented individuals who apply for visas for the United States. So hopefully the State Department will listen to you and come up with a better algorithm to match the talented people all over the world who would like to come to the U.S.
Yes. Well, I've actually had some talks with the consular office of the State Department and with Homeland Security, just at very, very tentative levels about whether it might be possible for us to help them think about those problems.
Because Canada and Australia has a point-based system, and basically you score on certain things. As you said, you make the ground rules, and automatically it's very transparent and safe, so they attract more and more people, whereas we have still a system which we don't know what the system is.
Yes, it's a complicated political problem. The thing about market design is it's almost inherently political to some extent, right? You're talking about a process that affects lots of people, that many people have strong opinions about, And if you'd like to implement some changes, then along with thinking about it like an economist, you also have to think about how do we form the coalitions that are necessary to change the existing process to something that people will like better.
It's always fascinating to talk to you, Professor Al Roth. Thank you very much for your time and appreciate your comments. And hopefully you'll write another book and we'll have an opportunity to invite you again.
All right. Well, writing books is hard, so I'm not in a hurry, but maybe I have another book in me. Let's wait and see.
Thank you very much for your time and your comments.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.